Okay. Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you all are having a good day. It's time for the Writestream, and it's about writing, and it's also the right stream to be on. Initial topics today are going to be genres, book genres, likable characters, and if we have time, we'll talk about macro plot structures. Macro would be the big stuff. So I've talked about little stuff. There is a demonstration a little bit on my website that came out today of maybe a flash fiction story, very short story with lots of little micro plot points that I'll go over probably in another video. But people are always asking about macro stuff as far as writing a book, and that's one of the easier things actually to talk about, but it can be one of the harder things to explain without sounding like you need to do this way, because most of the time when people talk about plot, they have like a very specific prescription for how you're supposed to actually organize a story, and I'm not a big fan of impressing upon a story a particular kind of organization. You need to pick an organization that helps you tell the story, but it's okay to have an organization for your plot. So let's take a look at the first topic. First thing I want to talk about is genres in books. So a book genre is like science fiction, fantasy, western, romance. There's also a genre called literary fiction, which I can talk about a little bit. But when you are writing a book or you're creating a story, there's the same thing with genres in comics, in movies, plays even. There's genres in pretty much everything. There's a set of things that define that genre, a set of idioms. And some people will say, well, like cliches. A cliche is something that is so obvious and so expected that you almost don't want it. But a set of idioms, similar to what makes heavy metal. Well, you have distorted guitars, you have particular kind of drum beats, modal arrangements of melodies and things like that. So there's a set of idioms that make heavy metal, even the vocals in some of the subgenres. Same thing when it comes to fiction. So if you're writing fantasy, obviously fantasy has a set of idioms that are incorporated into fantasy, and then there's a bunch of little subgenres. And so I want to talk about the relationship between your genre, your subgenre, and how much you should respect that, if at all. Before I get into that, let me see if there's any questions right off the bat, and if I can answer them after I start addressing that initial topic, I will. Okay. So I'm not seeing a whole lot of questions just yet. Let me dive into talking about genres. So when you are writing a book, chances are you're writing genre fiction. If you're not writing genre fiction, you might be writing what people call literary fiction. Literary fiction is a very amorphous term. Most people don't really read, quote, literary fiction, and when they do, they're not aware of what actually defines literary fiction as literary fiction. But usually literary fiction takes place in our world. It can have a bunch of different kinds of styles that go into the actual composition of the book, but it's about people that exist in the fictionalized real world, rather than having, as soon as you add fantastical elements such as people flying or something, you're in fantasy land. However, with really since 1950 or 1960, that division between pulp and literary fiction has broken down a lot, mainly in that what people consider literary fiction has gotten increasingly odd in terms of sticking to that sort of realist style. And you may have creative nonfiction that counts as literary fiction, fictional autobiographies, things like that. So literary fiction, it's usually about trying to present something like highly original within that context and not sticking to a set of idioms that are indicative of a genre. I'm not a big fan of that division, and I really don't like when, if you ever talk to, sometimes you may meet a creative writing professor that doesn't like popular fiction. It's like, well, what do you like? Unpopular fiction? You like to write stories that no one wants to read? So if you're writing popular fiction, chances are you're going to be in one of these genres. The genre is important because that's how consumers start selecting books. They have an idea in mind of certain things that they want to read, and so they go to the genre that fits what they have in their mind. If we look at fantasy, for example, fantasy has a whole bunch of things that go along with it. Fantastical places, fantastical creatures, different worlds in many cases, magic, dragons, all that stuff is idiomatic of fantasy. And then you may have subgenres like urban fantasy, magical realism, grimdark fantasy. There's all these different little subgenres that fit into fantasy. So if you're writing a book, you want to have a good idea of which of those you might be in. You don't have to stick to all the idioms of any of those particular genres, but it's a good idea to think about kind of where you fit in that. High fantasy is going to be a different world with usually epic kind of conflicts, the destruction of the world. Something that's more like heroic fantasy or adventure fantasy is gonna center around a personal adventure, personal conflicts, things that are a little more limited, but still in a fantastical world. If you're looking at something like urban fantasy, it takes place in our world, but with magic. So think of like Dresden Files as urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is a gigantic genre right now. A lot of people are trying to write in urban fantasy. So knowing those things can be important and helpful, but the first thing that tends to happen with writers is they have an idea of what genre they're in, and then they start trying to put into the bucket every little thing that makes that genre what it is. So if they start writing urban fantasy, they're like, well, I need a wizard. I need to have this thing that the Dresden Files have. I need to have this thing that like Neil Gaiman has or something. So you start putting in all the stuff all the things in the bucket that tend to define urban fantasy, and before you know it, the book is writing itself. And that's a term that I like to use sometimes. The book writing itself means that you've so constrained the parameters of what you're doing that you're not exercising a lot of creativity. If you go down a checklist and you're like, well, I'm going to have an everyman protagonist, or I'm going to have this elite wizard like Harry Dresden. I'm going to have a female love interest who's kind of a goody two shoes, and I'm going to have an antagonist that's like this, and I'm going to have a best friend who's kind of a bad boy. Before you know it, you haven't really written a story because you've predetermined every little element. So it's good to know where the genre is, but it's also good to let yourself exercise some creativity. One of the popular things to do right now with focusing on a genre is using things like Kindle Spy. When you make this transition away from bookstores, which have limited shelf space, to things like Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com that have unlimited shelf space, so to speak, they can display unlimited products, you have an increasing amount of genrecization, where there's many different subgenres of an increasing number and increasing specificity to each little genre, to where if you look up some of the genres in Amazon, you'll see that there's an angels genre, there's a like vampire genre, obviously, that's big, but there wasn't vampires as a fiction genre 20 or 30 years ago. Only when you can have a lot of books can people like really focus in and be like, I'm in the vampire genre, military fantasy, military science fiction, noir crime, modern crime, fantasy crime, historical fantasy, right? Like there's so many different little ones that exist there. What a program like Kindle Spy is supposed to do, and you have to pay money for this, is it's supposed to target these little categories on Amazon and inform you which ones have a lot of people that are trying to read books in that genre, but there's not enough books. So if it looks at like the top 20, and you could do this manually, actually. You could look at these. The problem is Kindle has like hundreds of hidden categories that Amazon doesn't really tell you about that are part of its very complex algorithm. And so the idea is you find one where like the top 20 books, it's really easy to be in the top 20, and it's really easy to be in the top 5. But at the same time, most of the books in the top 20 are selling similar amounts, meaning like the people that are reading it are buying a lot of the books in the genre, which means that there's just not enough. So you would target that genre, then you'd go look at all the idioms for that genre, you'd go plan your book, you'd write your book so it fits neatly in that genre, you'd promote it and write it and put it in that genre. You can do that. I don't do that. Some people, that's the way that they want to approach it. To me, that's not what I want to do. And I use a little analogy, and maybe I'll do a separate video on this in particular, but I call it the McDonald's analogy, or the McDonald's thought experiment. You compare something to working at McDonald's, and it's not that working at McDonald's is bad. It's a fine job, but it's a low-skilled, low-paying job. And, it's a job that's not miserable and probably not super fulfilling. In fact, it's not fulfilling, right? Cooking French fries is usually not a very fulfilling occupation. So if you compare what you're doing, what you're spending your time on, to working at McDonald's, are you making the same amount of money working at McDonald's as you would be doing this? If the answer is yes, or you're making more money at McDonald's, are you at least getting some satisfaction out of doing the other thing? If the answer is no, then you should probably just work at McDonald's. And that's one of the reasons that I don't, people are like, why don't you play in a cover band? Which is, to me, playing in a cover band is the same as not doing music. I don't want to play in a cover band. That has zero interest to me. I'd rather work at McDonald's because I'd make more money at McDonald's and I'd have probably more spiritual satisfaction going out and trying to be expressive with music that I dislike, which would be playing in a cover band or playing in a top 40 band or something like that. So I use that comparison. So if you say like, well, this angels genre over here, man, they like, people want those books. I'll write a book about angels. That's great if you like that genre and you want to write something in it. But if you've never written in it and you're forcing yourself to do it because you think you're going to make money doing it, it's like, why have this kind of why do something creative like writing if it's going to not be creative, if it's going to be just stories that write themselves? That's my approach to it. I don't actually have any judgment if that's what excites you is writing something in one of these genres, but for me, it's not for me. So that's one of the things that I think people need to keep in mind when they are beginning a book. And if you're in NaNoWriMo, we're still kind of in the swing of that. You don't have to put in every little thing from a genre. As long as you hit the big parts of a genre, that's probably going to be good enough to get in there. And you probably always want to have something that is very original about that genre. And the thing is, I usually say you probably ought to write the genres that you already read and like, because you're going to know what readers actually want to see out of those. So if you're writing in vampires, obviously the readers want to see vampires, but what kind of vampires do they want to see? If I go and look at, what books are in the vampire genre on Amazon right now, most of the books are not going to be books that are like Bram Stoker's Dracula. That is, books that are frightening and psychological and where vampires are bad, evil forces of nature. Instead, it's going to be something that follows Anne Rice. It's from like a vampire's perspective, vampire love stories and things like that. That's kind of what is popular post Twilight. So if you are wanting to write that, then you can do that and maybe do something original with it. If not, then if what you want to write is Bram Stoker, it's not going to neatly fit into what that genre is now. So it's kind of good to be aware of that. You could write Bram Stoker, but you'd be writing it in the horror genre, in one of the horror genres, rather than in the vampires genre. And one of the problems with Kindle is that if you write a horror book that has vampires in it, it's going to end up in the vampire genre. So if you look through the vampire genre, you're going to see Salem's Lot by Stephen King, which doesn't fit into the modern version of that genre at all. It's a horror book that has vampires, and it's not the worst vampire book. It was the second book published, but it doesn't really have an ending. And it's really about vampires being kind of bad guys, not being mysterious, beautiful creatures or something like that. So that's something to keep in mind as well, is which genre you're going to be put in. So one of the problems I have is like my books frequently get put into side genres where they don't fit. So like Muramasa Blood Drinker always ends up in like Asian myths and legends, which is really not appropriate. This is really like historical fiction or historical fantasy, but it just kind of ends up in the wrong genre because of the tags and because of the content and things like that. So having to fine tune what kind of Kindle tags you have will help you get to the category that has the right readers for your book, and your book will have the right elements to attract the right readers. Something that Muramasa actually doesn't really fit neatly into even these finely tuned genres because it's samurai fiction, and it's not even like a hidden category on Kindle right now. But the people who actually find it and read it and like it, the algorithm's still specific enough that it shows it to a lot of people who are into that. They end up liking the book, so that's a good thing. Okay, so that's my basic thing about genres. Should you stick to the idioms of the genre? Know which ones you really ought to stick to. For instance, if you're writing high fantasy, things like sword and sorcery and dragons are cool. but you can add something original like guns if you want to, and that will be something unique to that particular genre that people will like. If you're writing something like a crime, a psychological thriller or something like that, you can add one or two elements that are really strange. You can add a supernatural element, or aliens or something weird like that, or some sort of other kind of political conspiracy that fits into that. So as long as the big parts of the genre are there, it's going to be good, and then you're going to present some original stuff to a reader as well. So that's my usual, I guess, advice. Let's see if there's any questions. Are you familiar with the fountain markup? If so, what are your opinion on it? I'm not familiar with that. I don't really know what that is. Sorry. I just finished my 3rd book manuscript. Off to format it now. Okay, cool. Congratulations. It's a hard thing to finish a book. Switch to Linux with LaTeX? No. Oh, no, someone else is talking about that. No, I use LibreOffice. Okay. But enough people are saying I should use that. I have downloaded distro with... Okay, never mind. That's two people having a conversation. I format everything with Microsoft Word, by the way, including the interiors of books. I don't know if I've said this before, but you can do everything you need to with Microsoft Word. And because it writes things as an XML file, essentially, it's pretty easy to get them really fine-tuned, even if you want to do it outside of the actual Word program. So that's mostly what I use. Happy early Turkey Day. I'm not a fan of NaNoWriMo. So yeah, it's Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is actually one of my least favorite holidays, and that is because I don't like Thanksgiving food. I've never liked any of the things that are traditionally served at Thanksgiving. I usually don't like. Turkey is actually one of my favorite foods, but not the way it's served at Thanksgiving. I don't like slowly roasted, oven roasted whole turkeys. In fact, when I was a kid, my dad decided at some point that he didn't like it either and started cutting up turkeys and grilling them and doing all kinds of other things. I don't like mashed potatoes or mashed sweet potatoes, or I hate stuffing. Most of the food that occurs at Thanksgiving I intensely dislike. And the other thing is, I would really like to fast for Thanksgiving, because in 2018 in the West, every day is a feast. Every day is a feast if you want one. We have so much wealth. There's so much food available. Every day is a feast day. So it would make more sense, if you want to give thanks, that you would remind yourself of the reality that hunger is possible and have a day of no food. So that's what I prefer to do, but everyone hates that. And everyone hates you if you show up and don't eat Thanksgiving dinner, and don't at least eat some of the things. So I usually, choke down some of the food. And my wife started making me paella for Thanksgiving, which people like. It doesn't fit into that, but she's just like, I just want to make something that you actually like. I'm like, okay. I feel kind of bad about that, but whatever. So I think it'd be better to do that in the West. That would be a better tradition now than having a feast when, every day's a feast day, and there's essentially infinite food if you live in the West. So just some thoughts on Thanksgiving. Great literature doesn't take 30 days to write. Okay, so I've heard this one before, right? So I came out with some books. I wrote like 3 books and put them out in 60 days. They were entirely written within about 40 days. You can write something in 30 days, and actually great literature has been written in 30 days. I'm trying to remember who used to do it, but Robert Jordan used to write books in a week. You had so he would write a Conan book in his spring break from being a teacher. Stephen King used to write books in a month. He used to write like 8 books a year. So there's lots of writers that write stuff in a very short amount of time. It depends kind of on who you are and what you're doing. Michael Moorcock used to write books over the weekend. He would just write nonstop. He'd plan the book and then execute it and write the book very quickly. And then, clean up what you wanted to in editing and put it out. And so some people will be like, well, that's a pulp genre. Most, quote, literary fiction I read, I'm like, this is something that somebody may have spent too long on. I think Stephen King's advice is, you should finish a book in 1 season. Because anything longer than a season, anything longer than 3 months, and you're no longer the person you were when you started writing the book, and you're no longer going to view the book in the same way as the person who began the book. So yes, you can write things in 30 days. It's totally possible. I've written several books within about a 30-day time frame or a little bit more. And keep in mind, I do always burn a couple days, like, putting covers together and doing all of the manual work of publishing ahead of time so that I can like actually get books out on time. So yes, you can write books in 30 days. And there's some authors that literally only write like 1 or 2 months a year and spend the rest of the year doing nothing, because that's what they can do. They can exercise their creativity in an intense fashion for 30 days, like a boot camp mentality. Then they're done. I've written screenplays in like 2 days before. It's just if you have the time and you know what you're doing and you're really committed to doing it, you can do it. In fact, it's easier to focus for a short amount of time than a long amount of time. If you're writing 2,500 words a day for like 3 years, that gets exhausting. I know because I've basically done that. If you do it for 30 days, get to the end of the 30 days, like, yeah, I finished the book. So yeah, you can totally write a book in 30 days. Don't believe the haters that say like, you can take longer. I don't want to say you have to write quickly. If you want to take longer to write a book, you can. But don't believe the haters that are always poo-pooing people who write quickly. You can totally write quickly. There's people who create albums quickly, write and record albums within a week or a month, and they're hit records sometimes. So don't believe the haters that say like things that are quality take an extraordinarily long time to complete. That's not always the case. In fact, it's probably not the case as much as it is the opposite. Do you think there's a point where breaking genre conventions would leave a story worse off? Yes. So the point, not leave a story worse off, but possibly lose readership. I don't think you have to worry about making a story bad by avoiding genre idioms, but if you have none of them, then doesn't really fit in the genre, and you may have a problem with readers expecting to see certain things and not seeing them. So if you have an urban fantasy that has no magic, like what's the fantasy element? Like, I don't know. Things like that. If you have horror that's ends up being silly at the end, that might not satisfy people, and it really has to do with expectations. You can write into the void for yourself, and I actually don't think there's anything wrong with that, but don't be surprised when readers are not crazy about what you've written. Okay, that tends to happen. Is there a way to tell if you've got the talent to be a writer? I'm currently pursuing a medical career, but I'd like to write someday. You have to try it. You got to try writing some stories. What I recommend to people who've never written anything before, write one scene. And you can go to dvspress.com right now and you can see a single scene I've written that has a plot in it. It has a beginning, middle, end, and it has a couple of characters and their interactions and some different kinds of plot points, including, a random encounter. It's got some high tension stuff and then a big revelation at the end. And it's only about 1,500 words, which is pretty short. That's, if you were to get that, that'd be like 6 pages in a published book. It's pretty short. So you can check that out at dvspress.com. I think that just went live today. The story's called Lined Paper. So start with one scene and see if that scene is cool. Imagine a couple of characters, imagine a setting, and imagine what they're doing in that scene and try writing it. And if you can complete one scene, then in order to complete a book, you just have to complete a bunch of those. Right. So you break it down to the smallest step, complete one scene, and then you know that you can do the complete thing. It's like writing an album. If you can write one song, you can write an album. You just do what you did for that one song 8 times, and you've written an album. And it's kind of the same for a book. And it's harder to put it together with a big plot, but it's not that hard if you can do the one scene and feel like you're good at it. And then this kind of goes back. People have said, can you get better at writing a book by writing short stories? Not at writing a book, but you can get better at your prose, at your practice, at writing dialogue and writing prose and figuring out how to create tension in a scene. All the little micro things, definitely. When you write short stories, those will get better. How that translates into a book, you got to know the macro stuff in order to make that work as a book. Knowing how that tension is going to fit into a large 100-page document is a lot more difficult. Fountain Markup lets you write formatted screenplay in any text editor. However, you could also... Okay, never mind. Skip that because I don't think that's a question. You aren't alone, David. I find a lot of Thanksgiving foods gross. People find it weird that I don't like mashed potatoes when I like hash browns. It's a texture thing for me. I love potatoes. Mashed potatoes feel gross in my mouth. Like I put them in my mouth and I feel like I have I don't know, some sort of alien vomit in my mouth. I don't like it. Do you ever work on multiple projects at the same time? Yes, I do. And so I have been kind of this year, which is why I haven't put a lot of stuff out. So sometimes I'm trying to edit something while I'm writing something else. In some cases, I'm just kind of, I was in a phase for a while where it's like I just really want to focus on whichever project I feel like working on. That's what I want to work on that day. So I've done that. It's like, I feel like writing this story. I'm going to do that today. And that's fine if you don't have a timeline where you need to get something out. And really, I haven't been in a place where I've been like, I need to put something out right now. I'm going to have a couple things I'm going to try to get out by Christmas. So I'm on a little bit more of a timeline. But it's fine to do that as long as you are okay playing the long game with that. I know like some best-selling authors like Nassim Taleb, who writes nonfiction. He doesn't write unless he really feels like writing, and he doesn't work on, he switches whatever project he's doing based on how he feels about it. And of course, he has millions of dollars in the bank, so he really doesn't need to work on anything in particular. If you are trying to build a career, it's probably better to focus. It's probably better to focus if you're trying to build something, because that means you're getting stuff out more regularly. And yeah, you may not be able to work on the thing you're really excited about at that moment, striking when the iron's hot, but yeah, it pays off in the long term when you have a completed project. So it's not like yay or nay. It's really just what do you want out of it. I have something in my hair. It's probably dandruff. Probably some flakes of skin from my scalp. One of my books was a parody written in 2 months, which included reading the original 3 times. My latest manuscript was 4 years of heavy research. Man, 4 years of research is a lot. That's a lot of research. Man, that's a lot. What's your view on James Patterson? Do I have a James Patterson book back here? I don't know. I have no like particular opinion right now. You'd have to ask me some other time. What do you think about just starting a story without a specific genre in mind as to not limit any possibilities? As soon as you have a story in mind, you're probably in a genre, right? So as soon as you imagine, hey man, I imagine somebody and they're in this futuristic room and it's made of light and a robot comes in. It's like, well, you're writing science fiction already, right? As soon as you start imagining different elements of a story, you start getting into a genre. Like I'm imagining somebody's looking at a crime scene. It's like, oh yeah, you're in noir. You're in a crime book. You don't have to think of every single idiom. In fact, I encourage you really not to. Just to think of the big things that you want to have in the story. You'll have an idea of like what genre you're in. I wrote Muramasa with really not thinking of any genre at all. But obviously it's historical fiction because it's set in like Muromachi, Japan. Right? So it can't be, it's already in a genre just based on its setting and its story type. But I wasn't trying to adhere to some kind of set of things that tend to appear in historical fiction. In fact, it doesn't. Most historical fiction these days is like really dominated by what amounts to light romance novels. That's just kind of how it is right now. Let's see. How many books do you throw away before you feel like you have something sellable? It depends. So I wrote really 3 books. I wrote really 3 books before I published one. And I'm glad I wrote those because the exercise of writing them was important to understand how to write a book. And so I tend to learn best by doing, and I encourage most people to learn by doing. First book I wrote, I was like 19. And so I go back and look at it, and the prose is really good. Like I have a really, the prose is great. Dialogue is okay. Problem was I didn't have an idea of story structure, so it's just a mess. Like things don't flow. There's no sense of plot changing direction. All of the big stuff I didn't have. Second book I really wrote way later, like almost 10 years later. And it had such a complex plot that it ended up being really long, like too long. And the problem was not the macro at that point, but really just I didn't know how to make, not the macro as far as the plot, but I didn't know how to make character growth happen in the correct way. And so when I wrote, and I wrote a sequel to that book, and by the end of that sequel, I realized I was doing it really well. Then I wrote Muramasa. I took a break from that series, and at some point I started rewriting it, and maybe I'll finish rewriting it. But you go back and you rewrite something that you wrote that isn't that good, and you just like, it'd be easier for me to just write a new book. So I wrote Muramasa, and it came out pretty good, and I really liked it, and so I put it out. This year I've completed several books that I feel like are not ready to be published. They need a lot of work, and it's not work that's like easy to do. It's like a large amount of rewriting in certain points where I just didn't have moments happening the way that they needed to happen. The pacing is off on a larger scale, and those are harder things to correct and take a little bit more time. So that's why I haven't put out any books since January and February. It's just I've written books, I finished books, but they're not what I want. So one of the books I finished, I realized, it's part of a series. I realized I just needed to write more of that book. I didn't get to a finishing point in that book. I didn't want to sell people half of a book. So it's going to end up being a longer book, which means I need to go back and rewrite a big portion of it to make it fit in a little bit longer format, as an example. Another one is one that I shouldn't say probably, I may not publish under my name. In which case you guys will never see it because it doesn't fit with my brand and the books that go along with my brand, which is important, right? People tend to associate authors with genres, and so I tend to be associated with the fantasy genre more so than the horror genre. And because this book is kind of a horror story, I'm not sure if I want it branded with my name on it. So we'll see what I do with that. But not everything you finish is just gonna be great, and you have to accept that. And sometimes it's good enough that you still want to put it out, and other times it's like, it was a good effort, and I learned from it. Let's make the next project better, if that makes sense. Do you think that the write what you know advice is complete BS? Because I'm pretty sure Stephen King never had a disturbed telekinetic classmate that had Bible-thumping mother when he wrote Carrie. He might have known someone who had a Bible-thumping mother, though. He might have known that religious type of person. In fact, that overbearing, domineering, kind of almost puritanically raging personality appears in several of his books. You have a similar obsessive personality in I think, what's it called, Misery, which is an interesting one. Somebody that has almost a religious zeal for this author to the point where she's willing to torture him and like try to capture him and things. So write what you know. Is it BS? Well, obviously, I did not live in Muromachi period Japan. I know about it though, right? So if you need to do research to learn something, you can do that. So whatever you don't know, you can learn, right? It depends what you want to do. So I think write what you know is mostly BS. Obviously, I write fantasy. I don't know any worlds like the worlds that I write. The danger of writing something you don't know, well, it's a bigger danger in nonfiction than fiction, but the danger of writing something you don't know is that you're going to miss the things, like going back to the genre discussion, you're going to miss the things that make that genre liked. And so you're going to miss a lot of the elements that readers expect to have out of your book, and so they may not like your book. Versus, you don't have to, you can set something in New York City and not live in New York City, right? If you want to be super specific about some part of like East Manhattan that your story takes place in, you should probably know East Manhattan. But for the big stuff, none of that tiny little details, none of those really matter. If you write something that takes place in Nebraska, out in some farm in Nebraska, nobody's going to be like, wait a minute, that's not the Nebraska. And it's like somebody's farm in Nebraska. We know what farms look like. You don't have to know farming to write that. And especially if your plot is not about the particulars of how you farm whatever crop that character is involved with. You don't need to know it. Like, you don't need to know how a chicken farmer raises chickens to have your character be a chicken farmer, unless you spend all the time in the book with chicken farmers. Now, if you go and read something like Moby Dick, there's big sections on like tying knots and like all this specific stuff about how to sail. Obviously, if you want to include that kind of minutia, you should probably know it. But otherwise, you need to know like the cursory stuff, the big stuff about the setting and what the plot's doing. Most of the time, the characters are not doing things that have such minutia that anybody notices what's wrong with it, if it's not super realistic or something like that. Let's take some more book recommendations. I'll leave that for another video because that's too much of a sidetrack. Any tips on writing a story with just an antagonistic force, like a group of people, rather than having one person being the main antagonist? My work in progress story is a spy adventure in World War II France. Absolutely. Just look at Lord of the Rings. Who is the antagonist of Lord of the Rings? Well, it's Sauron, but you never meet him. Instead, you have the forces of Sauron that are acting. And they're very impersonal, other than like, you meet an orc named Grishnak, and obviously you have Saruman and you have some scenes with him. But for the most part, you're fighting a force of evil. If you are, if you like that, you can just follow that. An impersonal army on the other side. That's something that's a constant hazard, and in a lot of ways, it can be better than having some big bad villain that's chasing the good guys, because a force is something amorphous and always terrifying. You have this force called the Nazi army, right? If you're writing a World War II thing, and fighting against the Nazi army, you don't know where they are, you don't know what they do, maybe you don't speak their language. It's more focused on the danger that's imposed upon the protagonist rather than the antagonist trying to stop the protagonist and acting against him. You don't need a personal antagonist. And that's actually one of the problems of the Hobbit movies, is they inserted this big white orc in as an antagonist because there's no antagonist in the Hobbit, right? Who's the antagonist? They have a quest, they're on an adventure, they have obstacles that are on that quest, but there's no real antagonist. So, but movies, somebody was like, had their script manual out, and you're like, who's going to be the antagonist? There's no antagonist in this story. What do we do? Let's just put an orc in. That worked in Fellowship of the Ring. We put an orc in to be an antagonist, to like chase down and fight Aragorn at the end. And it's like, when I watch Fellowship of the Ring, having this orc be an antagonist that's hunting them, that's added in, is so like, even not knowing the books, it feels completely out of place. It feels just forced in, because like we need the good guy to fight a bad guy at the end, so we better put a bad guy earlier. It's actually, I think, one of the worst parts of the Fellowship of the Ring movie, and it's probably one of the worst things they did in The Hobbit, was try to insert an antagonist into what was really an adventure story. So yeah, you don't need that. How would you handle a plot that has many places the characters have to visit? Is there a limit to how many? There's no limit, but you want to think about, and this kind of goes to the macro plot stuff, you want to think about how many plot areas there are. Because if they're visiting many, many, many different places, it's good to organize your story around places that they visit and what's actually happening in those, so that the reader has an idea. So if you read something like Fellowship of the Ring, you're going to many different places, but each place kind of has its own chapter. Each chapter, as part of the large structure of the novels, has a little conflict and resolution that happens. There's really no limit, but the limit would be the number of places that you can keep track of as a reader that are unique. So if you have 20 different cities that the person's in and they're all the same, it doesn't really matter. You can have 20 different cities, but they're not going to be thought of as unique setting pieces after a while. If you have, the characters are in the mountains, and then they're in, some, like in my books, they're in some forgotten elf city, and then they're in a swamp. Each of those places has some hazards and some details about it that are memorable. So as many of those as you want to put in, you can put in, right? A snowy area, something like that. So the limit, there's no real limit. The only limit is how effective you want those places to be. How would you, what are you drinking? It's just Kool-Aid. It's some like lemonade. Just a thing about vocal stuff. If you're drinking a lot of water while you're using your voice, it actually can draw out your vocal cords a little bit. But if you eat something sour or drink something a little bit sour like lemonade, it stimulates your salivary glands to work, which keeps your mouth more lubricated and feeling more natural. So it used to be, when I would perform in a musical or like an opera, rather than drinking water right before going on stage, we'd eat like sour apples or like Sour Patch Kids, as weird as that sounds, because it just gets all the saliva going and keeps it going during the performance. If you start flushing a bunch of water down, you flushed all that mucus off of your epiglottis, and you can dry out your vocal folds that way. I know it's a weird thing to say, but you drink a lot of water beforehand so that you're there. But if you drink a lot of water while you're using your voice, it can dry you out a little bit. You ever get really attached to character or plot lines? That don't exactly fit into the story well? Yes. And then I have to make a hard decision about what I need to do with those. It happens to a lot of writers. You get attached to a character that you intended to kill off, and you refuse to kill him off, but you need to kill him off because it's effective. I do that. I use NaNoWriMo to write side stories. That's a great idea too. How important would you say sticking to your brand really is? I used to write medieval fantasy, but I also really enjoy more gritty modern-day realism stories as well. This clash quite heavily. From a business perspective, I don't know. Most people recommend sticking to a genre. Notice if I say Stephen King, most people are going to think that he's a horror writer, even though probably less than 50% of his books are actually horror. But that's whatever you kind of start writing in and maybe start publishing in, that tends to be your brand. Brandon Sanderson writing a crime noir book would be cool. I'm sure he could do it, and maybe he has done it, but it would be surprising to the fan base that are expecting high fantasy books out of him, or at least adventure fantasy books. So I don't know. I could go either way. For me, my concern is that it's so different from what I've done that I might want to use a pen name. And then if you're using a pen name, you don't have a built-in brand. Like you have to build a new brand for that pen name, which just, it's kind of like a waste of resources. So I tend to fall on the side of just like write whatever you want. And if somebody doesn't like the genre that you wrote a book in, that's okay. It's not a big deal. In one video, you mentioned that you tell your music students that just spending time with the instrument will make you better. But in another video, you mentioned guitarists can be terrible with practice. So yeah, that seems a little contradictory. But even if they're terrible with practice, if they're just spending time being terrible with practice, they're probably going to still improve. Even if they're terrible at practice and they just spend time with it, they'll improve. Now, that doesn't mean that practice for them is efficient. And that's one of the things I try to do as an instructor is teach you how to be efficient with your practice. If you're focused on practicing things you can't play yet, it's going to be a more efficient experience than what a lot of people do, which is get the instrument out and play a bunch of stuff they already know. Right? Now, if you just get your instrument out and play a bunch of stuff you already know, you're mostly spinning your wheels. You're just kind of maintaining where you're at. You're probably not really getting any better. But if you spend your time working on stuff that you have yet to accomplish technically, then it's going to be a more efficient experience. But either way, if somebody spends 2 hours a day playing songs they already know, they're still going to be better than somebody who spends no time with their instrument or spends 2 hours a week. Even having efficient practice 2 hours a week is not going to make up for the fact that somebody with very inefficient practices is still doing it every day. That practice tends to snowball. Since you mentioned I mentioned using a pen name. When should you use a pen name versus your real name, or vice versa? So I don't, since I don't really write with pen names, I'm not the best person to ask. I'll give you my thoughts on it, but probably ask somebody else who uses pen names and has maybe a better answer than I'll have. If you're writing romance, you should use a pen name. If you're writing erotica, you should probably use a pen name because you don't want your personal name, which can be Googled and cross-searched, to be associated with something that is off color. So anytime you're writing something that an employer at some point could Google your name, which employers often do, find the book and see that you wrote like a gay erotica story, and then say like, we really need to not have this person teaching third grade here, right? So I've known a lot of teachers that write like romance novels and things like that, and they're, in their downtime because they think it's fun. They always do it with a pen name. And that's why, is that you want to have the brand that's associated with that genre separate from you as a person. Certainly if I were writing like weird erotica stories, I would do it under a pen name. That is definitely a line that I would want to do. Other people say you should have a pen name for each genre you write in. Robert Jordan is actually not, Robert Jordan's not his real name. I don't remember what his real name is. It's his fantasy pen name. It's the pen name he used to write Conan stories and then Wheel of Time. But he had other pen names to write in other genres as well. So if you have a ton of books, it's probably fine to have lots of pen names. If you really just have a couple books, just stick with your name. Eventually, Stephen King's pen name, Richard Bachman caught up with him, and people realized it was just more Stephen King stuff. So I don't know. I don't have a great answer to it. Let's see here. Can you bring on a eureka state where a muse is beating you over the head and you don't have to try so hard? I don't know how to bring it on. Sorry. Some people think drugs do it, but I don't. I think sometimes, for me, I have those realizations when I'm out and my mind isn't otherwise occupied. We have a lot of things that are assaulting our senses all the time. You know, there's music playing all the time. You have a phone with you, and that could be a temptation to pick this up and want to want to listen to music while you're out walking. So a lot of times silence by itself, all of a sudden your thoughts are better able to connect. A lot of times I have trouble sleeping at night. I have insomnia occasionally where my mind is so active that I can't sleep and I have to get up and write or do something else. Those aren't really eureka moments, but they're moments where there's a lot of connections happening. Is Immortal Engines going to be worse than the Hobbit movie? My guess is yes. Things only get worse. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be worse than the Hobbit movie. Do things only get worse? It's easier for them to get worse than to get better. If you do something that's really good, it's like there's only one way to go, and that's down. Now, if you write something that's really bad, there's only one way to go, and that's up. So Peter Jackson did a very good film trilogy with Lord of the Rings, which means everything's going to be compared to his best. Same thing with Star Wars. Every Star Wars movie is like, I wanted it to be Empire Strikes Back. Well, if you're always comparing it to the one you like the best, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to replicate whatever the best version of something is. That's why every time a new Metallica album comes out, you compare it to the stuff from the 80s, because that's what it is. You're always comparing it to the best. Is it easier to write in first person or third person? I usually do not write in first person, ever. There's some technical reasons why I don't like that. Main one is you can't present, you're in less control. You have less control of the information you're presenting to the audience, and the audience has a reasonable expectation in a first-person perspective story that the protagonist is never in mortal danger because he's telling this to you in past tense. Likewise, I don't like writing in present tense. It feels weird and awkward and doesn't look good on the page. I know some bestsellers have been written in present tense. I'm not a fan of it. It reads like green text from 4chan or something. So I prefer third person for technical reasons. Now, eventually I will have a book that comes out in first person, but it's not one where there's any mortal danger to the character. It's a comedy. So the tension doesn't come from, is he going to die? The tension comes from, other things that could go bad in his life. And so if you're doing it from that perspective, then with first person, you have a different control. So a lot of people like first person for crime novels because you have control. You can hide lots of evidence or obscure lots of evidence with a mystery that comes to the plot. So if you're writing in a first person view, whoever is writing it is describing the things he's seeing. And so you can just gloss over something that's important and have him focus on something that isn't important as a means of misdirection. So there are advantages to first person for particular genres like crime novels and westerns, I think, as well. But I tend to not write in first person. I think it's a lot easier to write in third person. Have you noticed that some of the best shows and movies on TV are based on books? It seems that in a way books are making TV better. Yeah. So part of it is that it takes a lot of money to make a movie or make a TV show. So if you have an already established IP, you have a built-in fan base, you're already hedging your bet, and you already have something that's proven to satisfy people rather than taking a risk and making something that's completely original that people could hate. You know that people already liked the books. So as long as you are able to capture what's important about the books, people are probably going to like the show. So I think that's the case with Game of Thrones, is that the show is probably more popular than the books at this point. But the books were popular and were good enough in their genre that as a producer you could look at it and be like, we'll just make this into some shows and keep all the elements that people thought were good or that we think are good as writers when we adapt this, and people will love it. And sure enough, they did. So you have a proven track record with that kind of stuff. It's less about, books are making TV better, but it's mostly because there's a lot more elimination of bad stuff that happens before you get to the book that you're going to adapt. So there's 1,000 books come out and there's one that everyone likes. You already went through 1,000 different trial and errors in the book market before you found the one that you know you can just adapt to screen. So it's not that books are making them better. It's really just that there's more trial and error that happens at a lower expense rate with books before you end up with something that you know is going to be a hit that you can just adapt. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. I purchased your Needle Ash series on Kindle. Enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. A couple of days ago, I saw that there was a noise stream up, but I couldn't watch it, and there was no upload after. Are those up anywhere, or Patreon only, or meant to be impermanent? They are up. So there is the noise stream on Jordan Peterson. It is up. When I stream randomly, it defaults to unlisted. And the reason I do that is because then I can, when I make it public, it'll go onto BitChute. And also, in case something bad happens, I can re-upload my local file. So usually I have a local file. Like right now I'm recording this on my computer. So if something goes wrong with the stream, I can always just upload the full file. I figured that out after my first stream kind of blacked out in the middle and ended up with 2 videos. I'm like, well, I need to make sure my local copy is sound so I can just upload that later if need be. So that is out there. In my opinion, character twists are overused nowadays to the point of non-surprise. Twists being entirely predictable, e.g. the faithful best friend is actually the traitor in the midst. Irritating. Well, yeah, it's irritating because it's just super familiar. What would be, I think, more familiar as a character twist is the protagonist actually being convinced to become the traitor. That to me is more interesting. So when somebody does something enough times, then it becomes interesting to change it. But the betrayal thing is very classic. You know, that's been going on really since the beginning of literature, is to have trusted people betray you. I mean, it's in Shakespeare. So that's a very, very old idea, is betrayal. So if you've seen it a million times and it's always set up the same way, and this is the problem with like writing by numbers or making the story so set that it writes itself, is that you're like, well, all these, here's how you write a best character or a best friend betraying the main character, and you follow like the writing guide and you do that. If your readers have already seen that set up in the exact same way, then they just are predicting what you're doing, and it's kind of better if you know that that's a thing that you can do, but you try to do it in your own way and don't follow a prescription. Wouldn't the Mary Sue fit in a comedy? Yeah, totally. Because if it's absurd, you can have a Mary Sue be absurd and a point of comedy. The problem with Mary Sue's as like a piece of fan fiction or like just a bad character, usually they're not intended to be comical. So Rey from Force Awakens is really not intended to be a comical character. She's intended to be a heroic character, but she just comes off as impossibly overpowered, and it becomes annoying instead of funny. At one point, somebody mentions a comedy Mary Sue sounds like Saitama from One Punch Man. Totally. One Punch Man is funny, and it's funny because One Punch Man's crisis is not any kind of danger to him. It's that he's so powerful, life loses meaning. Sorry. He's so powerful that life loses meaning. He has no challenge in life, which is very interesting. Do you have any favorite books on politics? I really appreciate your political videos also. Do you take inspiration more from nonfiction or fiction? Most of my inspiration comes from fiction and history. Not nonfiction, but nonfiction totally informs it. One of my favorite nonfiction politics books, if you haven't read it, is A Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell. It's one of the best political philosophy books I can recommend. Goes back to the 19th century roots of what we see as two different visions for humanity that influence politics. One which is the constrained vision, and one which is the unconstrained vision. And of course, you can put these in your fiction as well. The unconstrained vision sees man as a perfectible, malleable thing, and the constrained vision sees man as fallen but fixed. So he's an imperfect being, but his nature is fixed. It can't be improved upon. You can have good people and bad people, but everybody is subject to evil, and you'll never have a state of humanity that's utopia. The other one is like, we can have utopia, and how those conflict. It occurs in literature, but it's one of the things that you see in politics. So everybody, the left tends to be, the left tends to be much more focused on trying to improve the world, and the right is much more focused on removing bad things from the world. So the positive action towards utopia versus the negative actions of removing piece by piece the things which are bad. So piecemeal reform tends to be constrained. Wholesale reform tends to be unconstrained vision. So it's a very good book. I really recommend it, by Thomas Sowell. It's called Conflict of Visions. Of course, another great book is Free to Choose by Milton Friedman. That's a political economics book that he wrote with his wife Rose Friedman, which is very good. And basically it's just a primer on how the free market produces a lot of choice and freedom for people that you probably didn't get in your high school or college economics classes. So that's another one, although it's more, starts from an economic perspective. It's inherently political because you can't separate the two. Let me think if there's any other ones that are really good off the top of my head. There's so many good ones. There's so many good ones to think about. The Prince by Machiavelli. You can get that one for free on Kindle if you're a Prime member, which many of you are. Got to read The Prince. It is it's really everything. And then of course, although this isn't politics, but it really influences politics, is Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche. It's not the easiest read, but it's very interesting and informative for how you think about people in power and people not in power. Let's see here. Any tips for creating a magic system? I've done some videos on that. The main thing, you have to decide if you want a magic system that's science or you want a magic system that's magic. So an open-ended magic system is not really a system, and a scientific magic system isn't magic. So where on that spectrum do you want to start thinking about how magic is going to work? If you're going full Brandon Sanderson, it's like magic is science. It's not really magic anymore because it's so systematized that it can't provide anything but an extra science to create the fantasy of the world. If you go the other side and have it be completely sword and sorcery stuff like Robert E. Howard, and it's completely crazy and out there, or like classic fantasy, non-systematized, then magic can sometimes end up feeling like Deus Ex Machina, or Deus Ex Machina. I kept wanting to say that, but yeah, Deus Ex Machina, where magic just kind of gets you out of a tough spot. And if you can avoid doing that, then the magic system can be interesting. Or you can have a non-systematized magic, but it's removed from the main character. The main character does not do magic. So in Lord of the Rings, Gandalf has magic, but we don't understand his magic. Elrond, it seems, has some magic. We don't really understand their magic. It's more their art, and to them it's not really magic. But it's beyond the understanding of the mortal races, and so the mortals that are engaged in the story don't really do magic. They don't really understand how it's done. So as long as you have magic removed from the understanding of the main characters, it doesn't really need a strict system either. So where you want to put it on that spectrum is up to you. Wheel of Time is a good middle point where you have people kind of discovering magic along the way that produces more possibilities. Another good one, if you want to think about kind of a way to hack it, is the Harry Potter series, where the main characters are have a super limited view of understanding of magic, and there's only a couple things that they can use magic for, because they don't really understand it all. But adults are super powerful and scary because they know more magic, and this is one of the reasons that Fantastic Beasts as movies doesn't work, is because once you have the protagonist as fully powerful wizards, they have all the tools of wizardry at their disposal, then they don't have any kind of frightening limits the way that kids who don't know magic do. This is one of the big flaws with the relationship between the setting and the way the characters and the plot play out in those, is that whereas you had students that were learning magic and that itself is interesting, you really only had to, J.K. Rowling really only had to develop a tiny amount of a magic system for Harry Potter to work, and almost all of it came from Ursula Le Guin. It was just ripped right out of Earthsea books. So she just took the Mage College stuff from the first Earthsea book and put it into a more urban, modern setting, and just withheld most of the knowledge from the main characters, and that's how she did the magic system. So that's why magic is such a wonder in Harry Potter. It's why readers like it, is because they don't know how it works, that it's a world of wonder and enchantment. Not knowing how things work can actually improve the reading experience for a lot of readers. Have you ever experienced your stories just growing and growing? Yes. Totally. The second or third book I wrote, that's an old soda I drank. My story grew from, I was like, oh, it's going to be 25,000 words. And it grew to like 250,000 because I got to the end of what I imagined. And then I was like, well, there's so much more I want to say. And I just kept writing more plot without having a great idea of the structure in mind. And it ended up growing. It grew into like 300,000 words, which sounds like a lot. It's not that much. And then I, started dividing it up and understanding the structure a little bit better. So yeah, I've totally had that happen to me before. Let's see, economics history books. Last history book I recommended, or that I read and I recommend, is called The Storm Before the Storm, which is about late Roman Republic politics. Very interesting, very applicable to the real world, very informative as to the mentality of the late Roman Republic and some of the problems inherent with it, as well as some of the problems inherent with their own system, which is based off the Roman Republic, which a lot of people don't realize. I dislike world building in magic systems because the point of fiction is not to be immersive or realistic. The point of fiction is to be human, i.e. to walk and having learned something about yourself. I don't really think that's the point of fiction, because I can learn something about myself in the real world. I like things that are not my real world. That's why fantasy is and science fiction are so popular, because it takes people out of the mundane. It's the escapist fantasy that's big. So world building, magic systems, that goes into that escapist stuff, which is very effective in the modern world. And what you tend to escape from is not just like the mundane life, but from a life that has little meaning to a life that has lots of meaning. So if you want to find meaning in your own life, you're not going to find it in a book. You're going to find it out in the real world. That's my experience and opinion. Feel free to disagree with me. Science fiction can teach you about yourself or about humanity, but it does that by altering the way the environment is, and then having some speculation on how people would work in an altered environment, which is something I like as well. Let me move on. So I've answered all the questions. Let me move on to the second topic, likable characters, and then I need to stop the live stream because I'm already a little bit over time. So likable characters. The more I watch, the more I read, the more I understand that characters are everything. They're probably the most important thing you can work on, even though I kind of put them in that middle of the pyramid. If your characters are really likable and really good and interesting, people will forgive subpar world building, and they will even forgive subpar plots. So if you have great characters, your readers, your viewers will forgive a huge amount of problems that you may have in your book. Star Wars is a great example. If you look at Empire Strikes Back really has one of the lightest plots of the entire Star Wars series. It's very light on plot. A lot of the scenes are spent not progressing anything in the plot. But what they are spent on is providing insight into the characters and having the characters interact in a way that people like and grow towards each other and grow spiritually, physically, emotionally, and all these sorts of things. So you have all these scenes with Luke and Yoda training, and even the timelines of them don't quite line up correctly. It feels like Luke is there for years, but Luke and Leia are only out in space for like a couple days, maybe, you know, so the timelines don't even line up in Empire Strikes Back. But those scenes with Luke and Yoda really have a big impact because it reveals interesting things about the world building, which then reflect on you as a person. This idea of dark side, light side affecting you, and which one are you going to choose the temptation of power? Are you going to resist the temptation of power and focus on discipline? How is that going to work? And then you have this developing love story with Han and Leia that finally finishes at the end with something that is less than a full matriculation. It's very, very good with how the characters progress and how their dynamics interact with each other, much more so than the plot. And even the stuff that's revealed about Darth Vader, you have all this revelation about Darth Vader, and he becomes a much more imposing and frightening figure, and one whose backstory becomes a little clearer, and he also becomes in some ways more mysterious because of the way the cinematography is done, where you see back of Darth Vader's head and you never really see his face, but you know that he's like super scarred and messed up inside. There's a whole lot that goes in there that's so interesting that the plot doesn't need to be super heavy. Likewise, going back to Harry Potter, I mentioned that the world building, it's kind of like there's a lot of facade. If you try to dig too deep, the world building doesn't make that much sense. But you don't need to. People liked the characters in Harry Potter enough to forgive glazing over world building issues, glazing over, in some cases, very suboptimal plots, in order to get to the end of what the story was and what the characters did. So people's attachment to characters is really important. So how do you write a really likable character? Well, I've done those videos on the character archetypes. Starting with one of those is a good way to think about some of the characters that you can write and what makes them likable. What makes Han Solo likable isn't that he's bad. That's not what makes a bad boy likable. It's that he's masculine. And as a masculine but chaotic person, he's able to grow into a virtuous and masculine person. And that's what's so appealing to him. Leia is probably like a goody two-shoes, and so it's a perfect match. You have a highly lawful good, and then you have a somewhat chaotic character that have friction, and then that friction turns into romance. It's really like a perfect combination in terms of liking the characters and liking the relationship between them as they grow towards each other in a lot of ways. Likewise, an everyman like Luke, every person can put themselves in that everyman's place. You could put yourself in Harry Potter's place. You could put yourself in Sam's place. Sam from Lord of the Rings is more like an everyman. If the character has virtue, that's something that makes people like them. That's where you get Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. That's one of the things he recommends is at the beginning of the movie, you have the character save the cat. By saving an animal, you signal to the audience that he's a good guy, and you get the audience on his side rooting for him. They see him do something virtuous. Then you have the antagonist kick the dog, do something evil to signal to the audience that he's bad and make the audience dislike him. So we're attracted to virtue, and we're attracted to growth. And so when we see somebody that needs growth and is able to achieve growth but has some other virtue too, if you start with somebody who's completely unlikable and they grow, it's hard to like the character. You want to start with at least one likable thing. And what we like about Han Solo is that he's really masculine. So we start away with a character that's very masculine, and then we are excited to see him grow and change his ways a little bit. So that's one of the keys to making likable characters, is that they have some kind of virtue and they have something relatable to the audience. If you have a character that is entirely virtuous, like a Mary Sue, entirely virtuous and entirely powerful, there's no growth there, and the audience doesn't really relate to them. They look at that person, and the only feeling that they might have is either disbelief or maybe even like jealousy. They won't see themselves in that person's place. The only way that you see yourself in a person's place is if they have strong limitations. So that's the other thing. So virtue, limitations, and those allow you to have growth. And then people get very, very attached to the characters. So that's one of the things. I can do a full video on that sometime. What do you guys think about characters? If the point of fiction is escapism, then you are essentially wasting your time with a complex word search and connecting the dots. I don't think so. That doesn't make any sense. And Vader is Luke's father. Yeah, Luke has to confront the darkness in himself. Luke is the audience in this case. There's a big foreshadowing scene where he faces Vader, cuts Vader's face off, and his face is underneath it. And that cues directly into the fact that Vader is his father, but it's him as Vader. When he sees there, he sees the darkness in himself. He understands he could be just like Darth Vader, and that's really what that dark cave is telling him, which is so interesting. So, any other questions before I hang it up? I'll talk about plot maybe next week. I'll lead with some of the macro plot point stuff, and we can talk a little bit about plot formatting a large work in order to make the plot be paced correctly and make sense and have the right kind of resolutions. Can you have all dislikable characters in a good story, like Ron Moore? Boy, I don't know. I think, again, I think of Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Boy, like that main character is unlikable, and other characters aren't that likable either. If all the characters are unlikable, I tend to want to put the book down. Like my wife was reading a book that my sister sent us, by Steve Martin called An Object of Beauty. I didn't like any of the characters, and so I didn't like the story that much. I was like, it's technically well written, but I dislike all the characters and what they think and the way they act, and I have contempt for a lot of them. That's how I felt about American Beauty. I don't like American Beauty because all the characters are unlikable, almost all of them. And I didn't like English Patient for the same reason. I had contempt for every person on screen, it felt like. So I just really wished for them all to die and somebody good that I could actually care about their outcomes to let come on screen. I have a hard time liking stories personally where none of the characters are likable. And at the very least, you have to make them interesting. That was the other thing about English Patient. American Beauty, at least the characters were a little bit interesting. English Patient, they were just very boring. The characters themselves just seemed to have nothing going for them. Do you have any good examples besides the obvious biblical one of a fall story? Like start with a Mary Sue and then have the story about their descent breakdown. Oh, totally. So if you like fantasy genre stuff, Way of Kings does this, and it's a very good execution. At the beginning of the book, you see Kaladin as a respected leader of like a troop of soldiers. Next thing you see him, he's a slave with like a brand on his forehead that really just wants to die. And then his growth out of that. So if you're thinking about a moral fall, you know, there's so many. There's Macbeth, right? Macbeth is a great story about the temptations of power, the fall, the consequences of that. It depends if you want to fall plus a redemption or you just want to fall. There's a lot. I'd have to stop and think, but Macbeth is a classic example. If you want something from the fantasy genre, Way of Kings is a great example of having a character suffer a large fall, and then at the end of the book, you're revealed exactly how that fall happened. And the fall happened because of a great injustice that was done to him. You can also have a character who's very powerful suffer defeat at the beginning of a book and essentially have to escape as a peasant and rebuild life that way. That's an interesting thought. So I like what you had to say about Prince of Thorns. How would you change the protagonist, though? I would have had him be a kid. Would have had him be a kid that's tagging along with these bandits. And the bandits feel sorry for him. That's why he's there. And they tease him because he's a 14-year-old kid that has no experience and is weak and isn't that good at stuff. And he's constantly having to prove himself. So you actually have a chance to grow in that scenario. Or maybe he grows from a kid that they just think is a joke into somebody who's taking charge of a mission to go to this city where everybody's red from the radiation or whatever. And then he is able to end up being a respected member of the group because of his need to grow and be respected by the other people. That's how I would have changed it. So you could have ended in almost the same way, but where you started would have been very different. And what would have definitely the first third or half of the book, I would have had him be way less competent. And just be a kid, be a 14-year-old who wants to prove himself and wants to be a bandit. To me, that would have been a lot more interesting and a lot more relatable, because if a 14-year-old reading that, rather than looking at it as like a power fantasy, like, oh man, I wish I was badass like this character, it'd be like, I am like this character and I wish to grow like that character is growing and be like him at the end of the story. So you have the relatable one at the beginning and then the power fantasy at the end. What's a good way to have an intentionally unlikable protagonist? Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Have him rape someone at the outset of the book, towards the beginning of the book. Have him do something extremely reprehensible. And it can even be, I think in Thomas Covenant, he was thinking he was having a dream. It's been so long since I read the book, I need to reread them. But and I think there's like 3 more books he wrote that I haven't read in the series. But he rapes a character. He essentially like forces himself on it because he thinks he's having a dream, which reveals something very bad about him, that if he would rape someone in a dream, that's like an impulse that he would have. But he does something really bad. So it's an interesting thing. What do you think of characters such as the monk, the sage, the vagabond, the hermit, who are secretly master warriors underneath their perceived weak and docile appearances? I like that. So that's another kind of paragon, like Gandalf, like the Odinic wanderer. You can add into that. So it's a character that's really at the height of their power, but does not exercise their power openly. And that's great because you can have the character reveal their power later in the book, and really, really surprise readers. There's a lot of fun stuff you can do with those kind of character archetypes, I think. Having like a monk or a sage that helps the protagonist and then later reveals his power. I think it's a great one. Maybe I could do a little bit of a video on that. I really like when I see that in a book. And Gandalf is a little bit that way, Do you think godly, powerful protagonists can work as long as their antagonists can still threaten them? Yes. As long as the antagonist provides meaningful threat, you can look at the superhero genres, right? They're godly, powerful, but their opponents still present threats to them. So yes, totally. The Equalizer raped a male cop in Lady Cop. Weird. Oh man. Yeah. All right. So yes. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. I'm going to do these every Wednesday if I can at 6 p.m. And I'll try to do them for about an hour. This one went a little bit long. Last one went a little bit long, but there's so much to talk about. It's hard to stop. So next time I'll probably start with macro plot structures, and then we can deal with some details on figuring out how to structure something from a large perspective. Because to me, that's the difficult thing with a book, is knowing how to do it on the big scale. The micro stuff you can work on as like an individual thing and get better at. But then putting it all together, that tends to be a little bit tougher to visualize and actually execute, especially if you just start writing at the beginning and then you don't know what you're doing towards the end, which is how I approached most of my beginning books. I just didn't know what I was doing. Last question. What about silly and over-the-top characters like Baron of Munchausen? I like silly over-the-top characters. If they're foils to straight men, there's so many ways to talk about that. I'll have to leave it for another video. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you all next time. Oh, last thing, hard sell. You can get my books on Amazon or dvspress.com, dvspress.com. You can also hop on my mailing list there. I have some shirts for sale. They should be linked below the video there at Teespring. I have a whole bunch of those. So if you want to support the channel, you can buy my stuff. If not, thanks for watching anyway.